Hey players and playettes, Styx here, back for another video adventure. Today we're going to be talking about Final Fantasy XVI. Yes, that Final Fantasy XVI. Now Final Fantasy XVI, like most AAA releases this year, was marred with a diversity controversy. Now why that is the angle for every AAA game these days is a conversation for another time, but today let's talk about the real issue. Is Final Fantasy XVI Final Fantasy? Well, the answer to that is obvious, idiot. Yes, it's a Final Fantasy. You can tell by the title. You see, Final Fantasy isn't a genre of video game. It's actually a video game franchise that was created in the late 80s by Squaresoft and originally followed a more Dungeons and Dragons style formula and popularized the JRPG genre in the West. Most people would be able to come to that assertion by reading the name. Now, this as a point in the Final Fantasy or in the is this Final Fantasy discourse, while obvious, is kind of reductive. So in my opinion, while yes, you can say Final Fantasy 16 is Final Fantasy and stop the conversation there, I don't think that really gets to the depths of what people mean when they make the criticism about Final Fantasy 16 as a game. So now that I've played through about half of the game, I'm 60% of the way through, I thought I would kind of throw my hat into the ring in this conversation and see if this resonates with anyone. If it doesn't, I'll be fine. Don't worry about it. But I thought maybe we could have this conversation. So I am going to go over my experience with the game and kind of go over some of the core details that I'm feeling as to why people may think this is or isn't a Final Fantasy. So, full disclosure, I am having a great time with the game. I really enjoy the visuals, the storytelling, the art direction speaks to me in a lot of ways. I am having a lot of fun with the combat. So there are plenty of things to love about this game, and I love those things. Let's get that out of the way. Obviously, there are performance issues, name a game in 2023 without them, and other pacing issues that largely are subjective in how they're received. So I wouldn't call myself the gospel or authority on anything like that. But back to the criticism of whether or not it's Final Fantasy, I wanted to kind of break this down into a few sections so that we can keep this on track. So we're going to start with storytelling. The storytelling in Final Fantasy XVI is very much in line with every other Final Fantasy game, in that it's high arcs, high action, high emotion, little bits of humor wedged in there, memorable characters, and great music that backs up all of the action and the story sequences that really adds a level of emotion to everything that the player's experiencing. Final Fantasy XVI delivers in this way just like every other Final Fantasy game does, and in a lot of ways better. The story is far more mature than previous entries in the franchise, which some people would say is un-Final Fantasy, but I think it's fine. It's obviously set in a more European, more grounded setting, so I consider that to be its own thing, but it does it well, in my opinion, and I'm willing to go with that. In terms of the story and how the story is delivered in Final Fantasy XVI, it is definitely a Final Fantasy game and would be traditionally respected in that regard. Now, let's move on to lore and world building. Now, lore and world building is a bit different from story because the way that the world and lore is built up in this game is really one of the key things about how it's a Final Fantasy game. They take several different aspects of Final Fantasy, such as materia, and it's transferred into the concept of the crystals. You have the summons that are transferred into the concept of the icons. Chocobos are present, and a lot of these things are really worked into the game in a way that makes it all palatable, but is all still very truly Final Fantasy. In a way, it's maturing and adding these features into something that is grounded and consistent. And I actually like it a lot. It's a change in the way that most Final Fantasy games do lore and world building, in that most Final Fantasy games set you in a world where all Final Fantasy lore is basically established. There's generally not any explanation to it. It's just there, and you know it because, hey, it's Final Fantasy. That's a chocobo, right? No questions about those. Everybody does magic. Why wouldn't you? But in this game, they tie it all to bearers and dominance, and that only certain people are attuned to use this magic, and that there's a price that comes from use of the magic that is explained in the Blight. And all of that is handled really well, in my opinion. So in terms of lore and world building, I don't think anybody could really argue that this is a Final Fantasy game. But moving on from lore and world building, we have to talk about the elephant in the room. That would be combat. Now, there's been much ado about the combat in Final Fantasy XVI. Many were already worried about it because it had the Devil May Cry combat director attached to the game, and many people believe that Final Fantasy games have always been traditionally turn-based, and that moving in this direction was antithetical to what it means to be a Final Fantasy game. While I consider that the change in combat can be jarring for some, it's very important to note that Final Fantasy has never been tied to any combat. In fact, Final Fantasy is not tied to anything. It's not tied to any particular world or main character or villain or overall theme or story arc or battle system. So there is no way that you can say that the combat, while it is a detour from what you may traditionally expect from a Final Fantasy game, it's not really anti-Final Fantasy. But I think that it stands as a valid criticism for some Final Fantasy fans who may play these other action games, because what you feel while you're playing Final Fantasy XVI is strangely akin to some games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. However, when you then take the combat system in Final Fantasy and you weigh it against some of these games, you may find that there are some elements that feel lacking in that regard. So at that point, you're dealing with, not your traditional Final Fantasy combat, but not your traditional action combat. And that, again, can be jarring for some players who are expecting something that felt a little bit more like a JRPG, or even something that felt more like a traditional action game, and got Final Fantasy XVI. While I think it's a fair criticism to have as a traditionalist fan, the developers should still be allowed to grow and move forward, and if that's the direction that they chose to use for this iteration of Final Fantasy's combat, then that is something they should be allowed to do. Of course, you can have your own how-tos and input on how they could improve the combat system, but to scrap it overall or to say that on its face it's not Final Fantasy doesn't really land. And last but not least, the most important but probably least well articulated part of this argument is the systems. Now, while there are systems present in Final Fantasy XVI, it is lacking in a lot of the technical aspects that many JRPG and Final Fantasy fans alike have come to expect. And I know there's fanboys out there who are going to get very upset that we're criticizing anything about the game. But the truth of the matter is that it is lacking on the technical side. From the lack of a party system to the lack of status effects, which leads to a lack of debuffs, the lack of ability changes, the low options for skill trees, the inability because you have no party members to do any stat affectation on those party members, to implement any skills for them, your inability to even control your growth on Torgal or to set any other range of abilities for him, really lends itself to making Final Fantasy XVI feel like while it's accelerated on the level of even combat, art design, presentation, and storytelling, when it comes to the engaging aspects of an RPG that are usually present in these games, Final Fantasy XVI seems to have regressed. And I think that that is a very fair criticism, and of course the developers have the right to change things and to make moves on the fly and do what they feel is best for the game. However, when it comes to combat, you can feel like there is an evolution there for Final Fantasy, even if it's not your ideal combat standard. But when it comes to the elements of RPG beyond the storytelling, Final Fantasy XVI feels like it's taken a step backwards for the franchise because it is lacking in systems, which makes players feel like they are in turn lacking in growth or progression in the game in any meaningful way beyond the story. There are low rewards in terms of cash and EXP for slaying regular monsters in the field, so there's even a lack of incentive to grind. And there's a crafting system in the game for all of the materials you collect while slaying normal enemies, but even that feels like an afterthought. So the combination of these factors really does take away from the core of what should feel like an RPG in this game and pushes it more towards feeling like a really intense story with an action game. So overall, can this be corrected? I think that Final Fantasy XVI is a great game. And I think that if expanded upon, many of the elements that are already present in Final Fantasy XVI could make a totally awesome traditional Final Fantasy game. For example, if status effects were added to the game, you could have a whole host more items to use, and the whole buff debuff cycle would be present in the game. It's currently lacking. If you had party members whose inventory and stats you could manage, there would be a lot more progression felt by players and a lot more to do in the game. But when you find yourself having these systems that are just on the cusp of being fleshed out and have been fleshed out in other games that just aren't here, it's disappointing. The verdict. If it wasn't a mainline Final Fantasy entry, a lot of the criticisms that it has faced from gamers who are playing it would not be there. But as a mainline Final Fantasy title and attached to all of the history, it does make people feel like there are certain things that they have come to expect that are missing. Now, are those people crazy? Are they a little over the top? Hell yeah. Are they right? Kind of. Is it Final Fantasy? I don't think that's arguable, but I do think that there's a conversation that could be had here, and I hope that I was able to add something to it. Well, if you like this video, like the video. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Do all that YouTube stuff. If you don't like the video, then you're not Final Fantasy. So there. Take care of yourselves, and remember, until next time, if you want to get on the game, get on the sticks. Peace.